I've always had an interest in the sacred feminine. Way back, not so much when I was a nun, it came really more when I was a mother, when I became a mother. And I was suddenly wondering, how do women do this? And that was really what led to my first book, Women of Wisdom, was looking for the stories of women. And then I began to wonder about this thing called the feminine principle in Buddhism. And I had heard about it, and I had this really strong interest in it. And I remember asking Trungpa Rinpoche about it, and he gave me a Tibetan text and said, this is about the feminine principle in Buddhism. At that time I didn't really read Tibetan very well, and I never read it. And eventually gave it back to their library, so I don't even know what it was. But I also sponsored an early translation of the biography of Machi Klaptrin way back in, it was right after I'd had Sherab, so 1974. And so I always had this interest in the stories of women, teachers, and just women practitioners, and how did they do it, particularly after I became a mother. And suddenly I noticed that I was a woman, and that it really actually was different for us. And not that I didn't notice it before that I was a woman, obviously, but more I saw the challenges and the difficulties of the path. And so I had a kind of longing to hear the stories of other women. And so Tara Mandala has been informed by that interest and that commitment that I've made. And I've actually been through a lot in terms of my commitment to this within the Buddhist world, the patriarchal world of Buddhism, who say, well, if you're interested or feel that the reemergence of the feminine is important or anything like that, you're being dualistic. And of course, you know, we don't want to be dualistic, so we shouldn't talk about these things. And of course, they're not an issue because mind is beyond all gender, and if you really understood the nature of mind, you wouldn't have these thoughts and considerations. So I really thought about that, and my shift or my recommitment to it and sort of, yeah, depth commitment to it came in 2001 when 9/11 happened. And everyone had that experience in a different way. But for me, I wondered, where is the feminine here in the lives of these men? And also in the lives of our response, the people, the Americans that respond. I just felt there was this incredible lack of that in that whole event. And I was in a year retreat at that time. I didn't see the television. I just heard about it from my husband, who was bringing me food. And I had a very strong reaction in that sense. And it was at a time when I was really questioning my commitment to the feminine, and what was this really dualistic, and should I drop it, and was it actually an obstacle in terms of my path? And so I think that at the absolute level there is no gender, that's clear. But at the relative level we see all kinds of problems and discrimination and imbalances because of the lack of it within Buddhism and all over the world. And so we can focus on this small issue of nuns in the Tibetan tradition, and we can see this, and then we can sort of widen our lens and look out across the landscape of the rest of humanity and realize there's still female genitalia mutilation, there's still such incredible high levels of rape and abuse and just endless amounts of injustice. And I think this is something, there's that relative problem of it, and then there's also the spiritual problem in the sense of the lack of that presence in terms of people's spiritual experience, and God being experienced as male, and that then translating into male authority in the church and in the home and so on. So there's direct correlation between what's happening in religion and in sort of spiritual conception of reality and what's happening socially. And so there's that level, and then there's this sort of more difficult to explain and articulate level of the loss of the feminine in terms of that, the presence of that in the spiritual context of the nurturing vast wisdom of the feminine, and that really should be included in our world, and we need it. So Tara Mandala is partly about that. It is Buddhist, and it has this dedication to the sacred feminine. It's also not only about that. This place is not only about that. It's about practice, and it's about depth practice, which is beyond gender. But it has both those qualities, and it's certainly not just for women. There's many men that come here and live here and are on staff here and feel completely included, and it's not about women being better than men, or that we need separation and or anything like that. And more men are realizing we need the feminine, and they need the feminine, and they worship the feminine, and they recognize the same need. And so I think Tara Mandala is quite unique place in that it's always had this idea of the reemergence of the sacred feminine as part of our vision. But now there's the temple that's there, and it's a living mandala, and the structure itself transmits this energy. It's round, and then the hallways are arched and rounded, and the ceilings are rounded, and it has this sort of quality of being around. You can circumambulate every level. You can kind of spiral through the building, which is also, the spiral is an ancient image of the feminine. And so it's happening. It's happened almost completely now. So it's 15 years now that we've been here on the land. It was 10 years before we had any buildings. We were many years under the trees, and our kitchen was under a tree, and we were in yurts and teepees and tents. So 2005 our first building was completed.
Congratulations.
Yeah, thank you.
And thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
For your work.
Thank you for what you're doing.